Hey guys, what's up? My name is Zach, and today we're going to be doing an election prediction between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan. So most of you probably know who Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan are. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he was the president during the World War II and led America to victory during World War II. He also installed a number of welfare programs during his New Deal era to help lead America out of the Great Depression, causing a great number of economic upturns for the American economy. And he's credited with being one of the greatest U.S. presidents of all time. And so is Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was the president during the 1980s, and during the end of the Cold War. He helped lead America to the end of the Cold War. His economic policy, known as Reaganomics, is still used heavily by the Republican Party today. And so both these presidents are considered to be the founders or the leaders of the modern-day Democratic and Republican parties, respectively. Roosevelt's welfare programs, such as Social Security, are still a bedrock of the Democrats' economic policy to this day. Same with Reagan. Reagan's economic policies regarding tax cuts and to instill economic growth is a bedrock of the Republican Party to this day. And both these former presidents are considered by most to be some of the greatest presidents of all time, as I already said. So an election between them should look pretty interesting. And keep in mind that this election would take place in modern-day 2020, not during the 80s, not during the 40s or 30s. This would be modern day. So let's see how that would turn out as I go through the safe states. So for the most part, the electoral map looked the same. I know that both these presidents during their electoral years won most of the United States. Ronald Reagan won most of the United States in a landslide. Roosevelt won most of the United States in a landslide, I believe, in every single one of his re-election campaigns. But I think that pretty much negates itself when you're going through modern day 2020, a modern day 2020 electoral map. I think that kind of negates itself, so I won't be taking that too much into consideration, considering that the political makeup of these states has heavily changed since then, obviously. So I won't be taking that too much into consideration. All right, so Georgia I consider likely for Ronald Reagan. One thing that Ronald Reagan will have going for him is that he will have a very, very high turnout of Republicans. In fact, I think that most Republicans, even if they have never voted in a single election before, will go out and vote for Ronald Reagan just because his name just brings inspiration to a lot of Republicans and is used pretty frequently by Republicans when campaigning just because he was the face of the Republican Party and still is. His policies are what the Republican Party today aspires to live up to. So he would have peaked Republican turnout on the side without a doubt. So I'm going to call Georgia solid in this column, and it's for the reason because Roosevelt is campaigning in an era where the Democrats are no longer so much of a white party and more of a minority party, and that's not the Democratic Party that really existed back then during the 30s and 40s. So that's one negative that Roosevelt will have going for him, is that he cannot have very strong minority appeal. So for that reason, Georgia would be called solidly in Reagan's favor. Virginia would be likely in Roosevelt's favor just because of the state's Democratic makeup today and the fact that Roosevelt could get pretty solid approval amongst Democrats. As for minority turnout, he won't get very much of that in this state. However, this state has enough of a Democratic base already to be likely in any Democrat's column, not just FDR's. New Mexico, same deal. It would be likely in Roosevelt's column just because of the state's Democratic makeup and the peaked Democratic turnout, which would occur if FDR's name was on the ballot. Now going over to Texas, I call this state likely in Reagan's column. For the reason because Roosevelt did win this state, I believe, in every single one of his re-election years, but then, of course, this state was very different in terms of political makeup back then, and most likely will not see a significant shift towards Roosevelt, but still, Reagan will see peaked Republican turnout, which would be unlike any Republican has ever seen before in modern-day American politics, but that would still have to go against FDR's Democratic turnout, which would also occur in this state, which would make this state likely. Not for the same reason that's usually called likely, but for those two factors that I just mentioned. Maine's 2 electoral votes I call likely in Roosevelt's column, just because of the state at large Democratic makeup, and Roosevelt's name on the ballot would also drive out turnout. and then Reagan's name would also drive out Republican turnout, which would balance the state out to likely Democrat. Then going up to Iowa, this state would be likely, if not solid, in Reagan's column. This state does have a significant number of registered Republicans that would be turning out en masse for Reagan, which would make this state likely in Reagan's column. Going down to Arizona, this state would also be likely in Reagan's column, if not solid. But you also have to consider Roosevelt's Democratic turnout. In general, there would be peaked turnout for both the Democrats and the Republicans throughout, which really occurs in just both factors negating each other, resulting in Texas becoming likely, even though Reagan's on the ticket, because Roosevelt is also on the Democrats' ticket. So therefore, Democratic turnout would also be peaked alongside Republicans. So it just balanced itself out to likely, if that makes sense. Okay, so going over to North Carolina, I consider that state likely in Reagan's column. He can turn out a significant number of Republicans in this state, and then Roosevelt would not have a significant amount of minority turnout, which would make the state go likely in Reagan's column rather than leaning, which would probably be the case if Roosevelt did have minority support. Ohio, I'm going to call likely in Reagan's column, and this is because of the state's not heavily, but it has a Republican makeup to begin with, and many credit Trump's victory in the state to him comparing himself to Reagan and to him building up an image of being like Reagan in the state. So if Reagan himself were to campaign in a 2020 election year, we can see Ohio going pretty likely in Reagan's column. I don't think it would go to Roosevelt just because of the peaked Republican turnout in the state, and moderate Democrats might even go to Reagan just because of how prominent his name is, especially in Ohio. Minnesota I would call likely for Roosevelt just because of the state's Democratic makeup, and like I said, peaked Democratic turnout versus peaked Republican turnout would negate this state into being likely Democrat, which is what it would usually be regardless. Colorado I would call as leaning Democratic, and this is because I believe that Reagan can turn out a significant number of Republicans in this state compared to Roosevelt, but then again, the state does have significant Democratic makeup that Roosevelt can campaign on. However, the progressive vote he would lose and the Latino vote he would lose, which would make the state go into the leaning column rather than likely column, which would be the case if he did have minority and progressive turnout on his side, which I doubt he would. Actually, I shouldn't say no progressive turnout, because many people consider Roosevelt to be the first person to institute progressivism, since Social Security and the welfare deals he made during the New Deal era are considered by most to be progressive and is what people like Bernie Sanders want to live up to. But, I mean, it's kind of hard to say. Latino turnout, though, he wouldn't have, so that's reason enough to make that state leaning. New Hampshire I would call lean in Reagan's column, and that's because of the large amount of registered Republicans in the state that would turn out heavily for Reagan. The only reason why this state is in the Democrats' column otherwise in most other election predictions is because most Republicans in the state that are registered don't turn out to vote to begin with, and the amount of registered Democrats in the state turn out to vote more so than the Republicans do, so that makes this state more often than not Democratic. But if Reagan's on the ticket, we will see peaked Republican turnout, which would make this state go to Reagan pretty easily, which is why it's a lean. Michigan, I would call a lean in Roosevelt's column. We could see the same. So this state went to Trump in 2016, and that was kind of for the same reason that Ohio went to Trump in 2016, or for similar reasons, because Trump painted himself as a Reagan-type Republican, which strongly appealed to Republicans in the state. But if Reagan himself is on the ticket, we will see the state have even higher Republican turnout. But then when you combine that with the peaks Democratic turnout, which will also occur, considering that the state does have a significant number of Democrats, which do fall into Roosevelt's kind of political ideology, will make the state go Democrat, or at least lean Democrat. At Wisconsin, however, I can see Reagan taking the state just by increasing Republican turnout on his side, just because Reaganomics, I feel, appeals to a very large amount of people in Wisconsin, and I can see this state going to Reagan's column fairly easily. Pennsylvania, I will call leaning in Roosevelt's column, for virtually the same reason why I called Michigan leaning in Roosevelt's column, because I feel like his economics could greatly appeal, or his economic plan and his New Deal style of governing will greatly appeal to Pennsylvania voters and Michigan voters alike, more so than Reaganomics can. So, and the state's Democratic makeup can also be taken in consideration, which would make the state go lean Democrat. Pennsylvania second, I would call leaning in Roosevelt's column. I think it's going to be a hard match between Roosevelt, or not I'll call it leaning in Reagan's column. I think it's going to be a hard match between Roosevelt and Reagan overall in this district, but I think that in the end Reagan will win over a significant more number of moderate Republicans and Trump Republicans and virtually the entire Republican group alike, which will make this district go leaning in his column. Overall, I think Reagan would be a very unifying force to the Republican Party, where you have very moderate Republicans and then you have the Trump Republicans. I think that Reagan will bring both of them together, which would make him a very strong force. As for FDR, I think that, sorry about that, this is my computer. I think that FDR's name will significantly raise Democratic turnout, but Roosevelt comes from the 40s and Reagan comes from the 80s. His name is more well known. There are people who have lived to see Reagan's political politics in place, so that's a big advantage on his part. Nevada, I would lean in Reagan's column, just because he can turn out Republicans in this state more so than Roosevelt can, and Roosevelt would probably lose a significant amount of the Latino vote, which would make the state leaning in Reagan's column. Then, and Maine second as well, I forgot to call. That'd be likely Reagan, just because it went to Trump solidly, and Reagan will be able to appeal to the Trump Republicans alongside moderate Republicans, which would make this district go likely in his column. And then when we go down to Florida, I'd call it likely a lean in Reagan's column, giving him the victory with 280 electoral votes, and that's mostly because Roosevelt would probably lose most of the Latino vote, and Reagan would swoop the Trump base in the state and the moderate Republican base in the state, making it go leaning in his column. So this is the electoral map. Overall, I think that Reagan has a very kind of unfair advantage over Roosevelt because he comes from a more recent age in American politics that most people can remember, and most people were probably here in America when they lived through his presidency, so that's a big advantage on Reagan's part. However, Roosevelt is the face or the face of the ideology of the Democratic Party, so that's a big advantage on his part. But he does come from an era where Democrats did not campaign in favor of the Latino vote, in favor of the African American vote, so it'd be a big disadvantage on his part, just because he won't be able to adjust to that that Democratic political strategy of appealing to Latinos and African Americans, which would cost him states like Nevada, states like Florida, North Carolina. So in the end, it's a very close race, as you can see, but Reagan takes the victory through Florida and through Wisconsin, you could argue, as well. And through Nevada, I think, Reagan also... so overall, I think that Roosevelt could have... If there's a scenario where Roosevelt did win in this election, it would be through Nevada, through Wisconsin, and maybe through Florida. There is a way for Roosevelt to win in a hypothetical election against Reagan, but as you can see, it's pretty slim. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I'm going to post, I think, like 2 or 3 videos tomorrow just because I've gotten a lot of suggestions, and I want to get them all out of the way. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.